Once upon a time, in a faraway land,
What are fairy stories?
The strange and wondrous place where nothing is as it seems.
Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest?
Fairy is a perilous land.
Before she found herself falling down what seemed to be a very deep
It
well.
is the place you visit
A world
in your
of
dreams.
myth and magic.
when the clock began to
The
chime
evening
midnight,
star sailed down through the
A
sky.
mysterious voice began calling to the sad
She
princess.
pricked her finger with her needle. 3 drops of blood fell on the
In a
small
trance,
white
she
finger.
followed the haunting
And peered
sound
into the
of the
hollow
winding
tree.
stairway to the top of the
You
tower.
can read along with me in your book.
she waved her wand and said the magic words.
Let's begin now.
Well met, witches, and welcome once again to Storybook Sacred Lore of Witchcraft. We've gathered today with a very special guest, Nathan King, author of Awakening the Witch Blood. Hi, Nathan. Do you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hello. My name is Nathan King. I am located in mid to central Michigan area. I run a grove out of the Minoan Brotherhood tradition. I'm also a traditional witch and love to talk about stories and folklore. So thank you so much for having me on tonight.
Of course. Thank you for being here. You mentioned traditional witchcraft. Did you want to describe your personal magical practice any further?
Yeah, so I draw really from 2, I would say, currents or whirlpools of the witchcraft movement, both coming out of the same time frame, but British traditional witchcraft. So right now I also am working with a Gardnerian coven and working in Gardnerian Wicca, as well as pulling from the strain of folkloric or traditional witchcraft that was coming out of people like Robert Cochrane, other traditions that sprang out of that, like the Regency, 1734, and those things as they have come to America, because we have a very unique melting pot of folk magic.
Yes, exactly. That's fascinating. And I hope we can find ways to weave some of those topics in today, because we have a very different topic we're discussing. You've chosen a book for us called The Marvelous Land of Oz by L. Frank Baum, and that was published in 1904. That is the first sequel to his novel, The Wizard of Oz, which was published in 1900. And of all the Oz books that Baum wrote, what made you choose this specific one?
Yeah, so with this, I was like, well, everybody knows the story of The Wizard of Oz. That's the first book. So I think it'd be a great introduction to show people who don't know that there's actually like 14 plus books, but 14 that Baum specifically wrote. And the second gives you, I think, the best introduction to just how different the Oswald is in the book versus the Oswald we all grew up knowing and loving from the MGM movie. But that book is very mystical. And that book has some very interesting, even illustrations.
Yeah.
And when you start to look at Baum's life and you start to look at his work, it's very much speaking to sort of greater themes and to the idealist that he was.
Yeah.
But also, this book came right after the success of The Wizard of Oz. He had no intention of carrying on the Oz books at all. But The Wizard of Oz got really popular. It became a Broadway musical. He made lots of money from that. And that was enough for him and his family to move to Chicago. And so I know both you and I have some very cool ties to Chicago and to the magical community there. And so if you are in the Lincoln Park area in Chicago, that's actually where Baum penned this book. And if you walk through the the Oz Park there, you see all of the bronze Oz statues. They're all commemorating some of that. But yeah, 1908 in Chicago is when this comes out, and he actually dedicates it to the actors who kind of made the Wizard of Oz story even more popular than it was, because in the theater element, it took those stories to the hometowns and kind of increased literacy as well by prompting interest in those stories. But they're very mystical. They still speak, I think, to certain concepts and certain arguments that we are still having of as far as identity and who you are and how other people may view that, especially in terms of maybe gender. And Land of Oz really speaks to all of that way before its time.
Yeah, I'll jump back, I guess, a little bit to the first book, which I do find very mystical. And there's this great quaternary system to Oz, and especially to that book, The Wizard of Oz, that I find is really applicable to a lot of our magical system. I mean, a lot of witches and magicians, we love a quartered circle. We love a quaternary system. I've read this novel a handful of times before, and reread it again for our discussion. I was a little bit under the weather, and it was kind of perfect timing because it was such a great nostalgic, comforting read that I sort of ended up reading it more for entertainment and getting caught up in just what an absorbing tale it is. The Wizard of Oz was unique. I often hear it considered the first American fairy tale, which is, of course, important in its legacy and how influential it ended up being in fantasy and fairy tale literature. And in it, we had a very unique heroine, a very unique American heroine. And I have always appreciated her character, her optimism, and her upstart problem solving nature. This book, we have a male protagonist, Tip. And I don't want to read too much into that, but did you particularly identify with his rambunctious, adventurous boy nature in the tale? Did that have something to do with you choosing it, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily, but there was that element of the, just kind of the wayward boy that I think I couldn't have helped but sort of identified. But I also identified so much with Dorothy and always saw myself as Dorothy. So it was, for me, it was this sort of perfect continuation. And as you read the Oz books, there's other sort of human child protagonists that pop into the Land of Oz at different times that you also sort of see that through their eyes. But with this book specifically is you get really immersed more so not just into the world, but into the different kind of characters that Oz is capable of creating. So you get, my favorite is Jack Pumpkinhead because he's not the smartest, but gosh, he's just so sweet. And he's so concerned and he's so, but he's not the smartest. And that's what leads to a lot of this trouble. So you can't help but just kind of have this affection for Jack. But also, there is this element of constantly creating. The powder of life is really what moves this story along, and the creation of that, and how old Mombi gets a hold of that. And then this, brings, I think 3 or 4 different characters in the book alone to life.
Yeah.
And they go on in the rest of the books to have very full lives, all because somebody said, we have to do something out of necessity and we have this powder, so let's do this. So it speaks to, I think, in the Land of Oz, and therefore our world, magic is capable. It's just depending on the knowledge or the tools that you have, or if you can memorize the words kind of sort of, oof poof poof in this book, but it can be whatever.
I love hearing you say that because I did want to mention the magic words. And how when I was reading them, I thought, okay, they could be weog, peog, teog, but it could also be read as,
yeah,
it's, he's spitting. And at some point, Baum calls them Kabbalistic magic words, and that there's even hand gestures that goes along with them, which is the pinky to the thumb of the other hand, and then all 10 fingers. And so in my mind, it really is like, after hearing him called Kabbalistic words, of course, you're going from the crown to the kingdom and then through the whole tree to bring this to life. That was such a fun element. And you mentioned Mombi.
Who's my favorite. There's 2 things. So first off, Mombi is probably my favorite witch in the Oz canon because she is unabashedly, relentlessly just bad. And when you look at the first book, right, you get the Wicked Witch of the West, and in the movie she's really hyped up as the big baddie. She's my favorite witch of all time in the movie.
Okay.
But in the book, she's not.
Yeah.
She enslaved a nation, and that was what she wanted. And she just kind of puts her feet up and has an eye patch and sees things. But she's very domestic for being a witch in the book. She makes Dorothy do chores. She's not really seeking more than just some power, but she's just kind of looks like an old granny with pigtails, and is a comical sort of witch, and intentionally so. I think how Baum was presenting her. But then we get Mombi, who kidnaps a child, who keeps this very deep dark secret, who's throwing every stunt of like conjuring phantom armies, which is very folkloric. This idea of conjuring phantom armies of the dead, which goes all the way back to Herodias and Diana, which I do talk a little bit about in Witchblood, but we actually see Mombi reference some of those magics. The big point here too is you can look at all of the Oz books from two sets of lenses. And the most important is that Baum himself wasn't, I don't know what the terminology is, but he was a subscribed practitioner of theosophy. So he was very well informed and very involved with the Theosophical Society. But I also think he was a very big reader and very interested in just these ideas of magic. Because if we look at any sort of literature, American literature at that time, he's really one of the only people who's talking about it that openly and is openly exploring those things. And he has that free pass because it's children's literature. And this is why this specific children's literature is notoriously going to be on the banned bookshelves. And it's going to make people raise their sensibilities, whether it's the feminine in power or whether it's the magic as possible and portraying witches in a good light. Whoa. But if it wasn't for Baum's mother-in-law, Matilda Gage, who very famous suffragette, in one of her essays, and it's something along the lines of Women, Church, and State is the title. She actually is pulling up all of these witch trial records and all of these concepts of witchcraft. And she's one of the first people to talk about the link of how these are innocent accused women and how witches truly have powers. And these goes back to the goddess cults. And so it's kind of pushed under the rug. No one thinks about this until an anthropologist named Margaret Murray picks up Women, Church, and State, gets fascinated with this idea. Then she comes up with her own thesis, publishes a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe. This gets picked up by a man named Gerald Gardner, and the rest is history. So I think that the Oz books really need the credit where credit is due because they are part of the source materials because of Baum's own inspirations and the conversations that were going on in the Baum household.
Mm-hmm.
And modern witchcraft, modern neo-paganism is inherently inspired and indebted to those things.
I had no idea that there was a way to tie all these things back into Oz and into L. Frank Baum. This is so fascinating. And funny enough, Mombi is not allowed to be called a witch in the book because witchcraft has been outlawed. So Mombi, so she has to be a sorceress at best.
You can be a sorceress, but you can't be because Glinda's going to hold that title.
Yeah.
And Glinda really, is even more, in the movie, everybody kind of joke of like, oh, she could have told Dorothy to cook her heels all the whole time. But if you read the books, Glinda is really, really powerful and is just way more powerful than you would expect. And she's just so there is something about her where it's kind of like, oh, she is a witch.
Yeah. And in the first book, she's also not in the beginning. So she does not actually send Dorothy on that journey. So she gets a little bit of a pass there.
Yeah, no, because people, if they haven't read the books, they don't realize that Glinda is the Good Witch of the South and that the Good Witch of the North is a completely different witch who has a different skill set, not very prominent in Oz. But Baum sets up this whole canon of how each of the quadrants of Oz has a good witch, has a bad witch. And at one point in Oz's history, somebody vanquished one another. So you had the sisters, East and West, who were big baddies, and they vanquished those good witches years and years ago. And then you had the good witch of the North and the good witch of the South. And there's like a whole series at some point in the series of that gives context of like all of that. So it's just fascinating.
That is fascinating. Would you be comfortable telling us a little bit more about the creation myth of Oz?
Yeah. Oh, very delicious. This is deliciously pagan creation myth. So it goes back to a fairy queen. And fairy queens are very much a part of the witchcraft current and their influence and how it is the witch queen, or it is the fairy queen who is said to often be the goddess, or to be one of the faces of the goddess that brings witches into the craft. But there's this fairy queen, and I believe her name is it's one of the L names. It's like Lorelei or Lolila, or I don't remember it off the top of my head. I'd have to double check. But this fairy queen basically cries while she's hovering over the deadly desert, where all living things that touch it would turn to sand. And so she cries into the deadly desert, and from her tears forms an emerald. And then that emerald bursts 4 big quadrants, which form this huge land, which is this continent, which is the land of Oz. And that emerald in the center is the capital, which becomes Emerald City. So it's not until the wizard who takes over and kind of dismantles the entire monarchy, and is actually not a great character. And we get more of his backstory of how, in dismantling these systems in Oz and very much colonizing Oz, which I think is very interesting, because one of the main critiques that people like to bring to Oz was Baum wrote a lot of very anti-Native American propaganda during his time in South Dakota. Very much a product of his time, but it's interesting because he's reflecting that exact thing in that sort of story of the wizard taking over. And not only does the wizard take over, and he doesn't outright say it, but he kills King what's his name? But the king of Oz,
Pistorius or something like
Pistoria.
that.
Yeah, King Pistoria. But they gotta get rid of the daughter, who is the secret, lineage that is the Queen of Oz. One day, he's got to get rid of her, so he kidnaps this baby, and he gives her to this old woman, and he says, "If you promise to keep this child a secret and to hide this child away, I will teach you the dark arts of magic." And so this is how Mombi learns her first tricks, her first skills in magic, and kind of he sets her off on this path.
Yes.
Which already implies that maybe the wizard did have some sort of magic.
Yes.
Because, but here's the thing. You read the Oz books, Baum did not care about continuity. There is no continuity in these books. But that's, I think, part of the charm, because there doesn't need to be. They weren't written for that. They were written for the pure enjoyment of children. So, yeah. So that's part of where Tip comes from, as it's later on revealed in the book. Spoiler alert, but hopefully you've read it by now. And that sort of idea of the passing of power, that idea of kingship or divine kingship, these are all themes that I talk about in my book, but are also sort of inherent to the witch cult.
Yeah, there's a few things in that I think we should touch on, but we'll have to keep getting back to it. So, funny, Mombi does say that the wizard taught her tricks, and that some of them were powerful and good, and other of them were just shams.
Phonies.
I mean, that's a great description of Crowley right there.
That's a great description.
or many Edwardian occultists, I should say.
I think it's great. I think, good witches, especially the ones who do it as their business, because you have to make money from it if you're making it as your business. there is a sleight of hand, and there's a theatric, and there's a path of what I call cunning that you do to sell it, because part of the magic of it is selling it, of making you believe it, of making anybody have that moment of suspension where you can truly have that moment of what if, and then you go in. So showmanship and craftsmanship are just two sides of the same coin. And so I think witches do learn some maybe phony things, but that doesn't mean that we don't know how to make them work.
And archaeologically, that's the theory going back to the Greek mysteries and even the Egyptian priesthood, was that real magic was being mixed with show for the masses. In the original book, in The Wizard of Oz, there is that repeating theme of each character seeking something that they likely already have within themselves already. And this novel, in a way, carries that forward a little, but in a different way. In the character of Tip, I would say, in that they really don't know what they're carrying within themselves, and they end up being far more important and powerful than they had ever imagined.
Absolutely.
And that is actually one of the very first things you write about, the importance of knowing thyself in the craft.
Yeah. And being able to, once you understand or have this sense of self-awareness, you're able to sort of see it or see that struggle, I think, in other people to help them along their journey. Because you can trust in your experience if you truly have that awareness or strive for that awareness. And so much of that is communication and having to be very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And for Tip, we actively see him do that. We actively see him confide in everything and everybody that he meets on his journey. He's one of the characters that, even more so, I think, than Dorothy. Dorothy's very pragmatic. Dorothy's very smart. Dorothy knows, Dorothy is what I would call street smart in how she navigates Oz. Tip is not. Tip wears his heart on his sleeve.
Yeah.
To the point where, he is with General Ginger, who is leading the female revolt, where all the women of Oz are going to come together and they're going to storm over, because very feminist ideas, and it's very interesting to see all of these things introduced in 1908.
Yeah.
Because it's reminiscent of the women's led marches that still need to be going on, especially living in a day of not with everything with Roe versus Wade, like, oh my God, this is part, I think, of why people are able to still see something from bits and pieces of the Oz books, because some of it is just forgive me, it's BS. Some of it is just like, what was going on here? They get really kooky and then get really, really weird. But I think you got to just kind of unveil it for the mystery that it is, because mysteries will always inspire. And in order for it to be a mystery, no one's really going to make sense of it. So it's that nonsensical art that is going to be timeless. And Oz is certainly a timeless thing. And Marvelous Land of Oz is no exception. A lot of people know the story, and I don't think they realize they know a lot of the story because they saw bits and pieces of it in Disney's Return to Oz, which came out in the 80s with Furs of Balk. So,
yeah, and you bring up a great point, which I talk about here often when we talk about fairy tales, is that there really isn't a simple allegory, and people try to apply them to these stories a lot, especially The Wizard of Oz, and many are in ways applicable, but none of them necessarily hold the symbolism of the story to one simple allegory.
oh yeah.
Tip does learn a bit of magic from Mombi. He's secretly watching her when she brings his sort of craft project, we could say, Jack Pumpkinhead, to life. And he ends up repeating that process on his own many times throughout the novel. Did you find any similarities with aspects of the craft in that specific plot detail?
Absolutely. And it ties into with sort of some of the reasons I wanted to write Witchblood, was this idea of, like, when people learn magic, there's always this sort of grandmother story or this idea of like being from this long lost lineage of witches, of knowing a tradition that is as old as time and is this uniformed way because it has a certainty to it. And people really want that certainty. So we make up stories to have certainty. And it gets, and I don't think we're in a world where those things make sense anymore. And so when you look at the story of Tip, I think it shows a much more authentic example of how we learn
Ooh,
magic.
yes.
Is you see somebody who may not even be really that skilled, because Mombi isn't that skilled. Mombi is an old woman who's just doing what she can, trying to, keep secrets, and stay under the radar from Glinda's watching eyes, because witches are not a thing or not supposed to be a thing in Oz. So there is that driving of magic for the people underground in Oz because other witches are in power. Very sort of interesting parallel.
Mm.
So yeah, it's this idea that you see something, maybe it's not skilled, maybe it's not authentic, but it still works. And you may not exactly remember what you heard, but you remember the spirit and you remember how it made you feel. So you're able to exude that same thing and it recreates itself every time. No matter if it's an exact replication, it's still coming from a different vessel, a different person. So for magic, spirits, the gods, I think we can apply this to even the working sites. All of these concepts that we work with, because they are so old, it is this concept that these ideas still have a space within them for the spirit of what is very old to live within them. But with each person, with each experience, with each individual experience, those things are going to be recreated upon themselves every time, because there is so much of that freedom of the artist, but also we may not know, right? It's that game of telephone. And so getting hung up on tradition with a capital T or validity or matching things exactly, I don't think is the point of magic, nor do I think is that healthy for magical growth. But it is important to know where it came from. So that way there is that clear idea of what it is that you're doing. But that may not affect the actual essence of what it is by the nature of the essence itself, if that very metaphysical woo-woo made any sense.
Yeah, it does. It seems like you're allowing room for innovation in that way, based on the practitioner's current situation as well.
Absolutely, because magic is made up, because it has to be. It's created every time. And every time, I'm never going to, I think, ever do the same spell the same way twice, because my situation is never going to be the same situation twice. There's also, I think, this idea of you use what you just have, and so for Tip, he's bringing things to life because that's just what's there. So they need to get to Emerald City. He brings the random sawhorse that's on the side of the road to life, and it's like, well, it's a horse. Why not? But that works. There's also the gump, and strapping together the furniture and putting a gump's head on it so it can fly. So it's got eyes to see and it's got wings to flap and a tail in the back. So everything is based out of necessity, magically speaking, in the Oz books. It works by the rules of the land and of the world it lives in, but it still works by that resourcefulness of the people.
Yeah, they even tell him, or I think he says, that the wings aren't large enough in proportion to the size of the body. But the Tin Man says, well, this is all we have, so we're going to try it. And then because it's magic, it works.
Yeah. And it works every time. And and especially when you get to Road to Oz, which is one of my favorites. And I think you and I were even caught up on like, we're going to do Marvelous Land or should we do Road to Oz? Road to Oz is really quite lovely. But you do get sort of more nuance in Road to Oz, not just of like how creation works in Oz, but like they get really into the magic in that book of like, you can think it and it just appears in certain spots.
And that this is so very early 1900s as well. That's very funny.
Yeah, well, it's utopia, right?
And yeah, so we talked a little bit about the creation myth, and now we have these characters creating things new, which brings up this other concept that you talk about that I really love, which is the idea of co creation and its importance in witchcraft. Do you want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, every witch is going to have their own practice, but I think there is this sort of unnamed uh, faith that sort of unites witches in this idea that, yes, we acknowledge this idea of fate. Um, and we may see fate as a manyfold being, traditionally, associated with the More or the Morai to the Greeks. We also have them as the Norns. But it's this idea that witches are witches because we've made a deal with fate. And we've said, hey, fate, instead of me just taking what you spin me, how about I work to weave the narrative with you? So we don't work against fate. We work with fate. I think that fate is simply the consequences to the actions of our own, and those are for our designs. And so to live consciously is to know that in those conscious moments of decision making and of speaking, you're actively handing those threads to the fates to start weaving. Um, and that whatever happens, if you are calling yourself a magic worker, you're taking control back over something in some way. Even if it's not something that may feel like it's in your control, you still have the option to write it down, wad it up, and leave it in the hands of your spirit or your hearth, whatever it is. Because we always have a choice, I think, to practice. And part of the decision to say, okay, I'm going to do this thing is when the actual magic begins. And that's part of will with a capital W.
We mentioned this already. So we do find out that there is a very twist ending to this tale, which is that the main character, Tip, we find out, is the long lost heir to the throne of Oz, and that they are, in fact, Princess Ozma. Ah! And yeah, so I remember seeing this as a theater adaptation on VHS when I was really young. I think it was a popular VHS at the time. I'd already read the book.
I
Yeah.
love this. I have it on VHS. It's so hard to find, but it's The Marvelous Land of Oz. It was done by a Canadian children's, like it was a Canadian filming company. But I believe that the children's show, the production, I believe, don't quote me on this, they were either out of Chicago or St. Louis.
Wow.
I don't remember what, but that
The special effects are really good.
the makeup is really quite excellent too. You can see the whole thing on YouTube though. So hopefully when this comes out, I will send you the link so everybody can watch it because it's
Please.
very, very true. Well, it's very true to the book. It's also a musical. So you do get some
Yeah.
musical infusions throughout it, but they're also taking some of the dialogue directly out of the Baum books. And the illustration changed. So in 1908, by that time, Baum was no longer working with his illustrator for all his previous works. This illustrator was W. Dunsloe. They had a huge falling out over royalties, I believe. There was something to do with them just being like, okay, we're not doing that. So the next illustrator he worked with was John R. Neal, and that is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, American illustrator within that time frame of children's literature because it is so bold, it's so distinct, but it really draws upon those same sort of illustrations that that he grew up with. So he's taking inspiration from the Grimm's fairy tales and the woodcuts of those sort of early Victorian scripts. So all the things with Land of Oz really kind of push that Edwardian feeling even more so. So you get even more of like the fact that like there's some humor that doesn't translate as well, but the aesthetic of those illustrations is very much of 1908.
So I remember being impacted by the twist ending when I read the book as a child and thinking it was a little weird in the stage production, just because, like, the wig and makeup, honestly, it's like they only have time for a very quick change and can't make Ozma as fabulous as she is in the book. But it was always a concept that stayed with me after that introduction in the book and the VHS. And I love Denslow's illustrations for The Wizard of Oz, specifically just really how cute Dorothy is and the lion. The lion is great, but I think I prefer Neil also. And especially when we get on to Ozma of Oz and we get this Art Nouveau influence and all of that.
Yeah, and Dorothy is, she's got a bob the next time you see
Totally.
her in
She's
Ozma.
like a sassy
She's got
flapper.
this very Edwardian,
Yeah.
very sassy, it's very with the times, but but Denslow gave us that chubby cheek pigtails that we all recognize as Dorothy. So it's cute, but it's Dorothy grows up, and you get to really get a whole new perspective of Dorothy as an American in the books, because she grows up, and I'm not gonna spoil it, but there is a book where Dorothy has to make a very big decision as far as what is she gonna do, where is she gonna go, because she keeps going back to Oz. So I'll leave it at that.
And Baum had this conundrum of how to get the characters to this land that was surrounded by a desert, a deadly desert. But I think it's interesting that it's almost always by catastrophe.
Always.
And I don't necessarily want to make anything too much out of that, but I think it definitely is interesting. And it's a piece of the hero's fairy tale cycle and the heroine's fairy tale cycle.
Oh yeah, it's a tornado, or it's a flood, or it's a hurricane, or there's
it's always a catastrophe.
Yeah, much later into the book that it's actually Ozma who's the one who's like, okay, girl, I got a system for you. Here's this magic mirror, and if you need to come back to Oz, you just go, and I will come and get you, girl. Like, it's like, we can't keep doing this damage insurance anymore.
Right.
Oz don't have the money or the emeralds for it. We're running out. So that comes on a lot later. But every time that somebody new comes in, like there's the character of Betsy Bobbins, I believe, in TikTok of Oz. And there's the character of Ojo, who actually, he's just a munchkin lad, but he doesn't leave the world. But all of them, they have some sort of harrowing journey that starts them right off the bat. And I think Baum was conscious of that because he was so well read and was truly, I think, he was a jack of all trades, but he was a master storyteller. I don't want to say jack of all trades, master of none, because he truly was a master storyteller. And that's why he was successful in all the different hats that he wore throughout his life.
And, continuing that thought about the catastrophe, I think I will make something of it, which is that it seems like the forces that compel us towards magic and witchcraft are just that. They're very compelling forces. And because this is out of necessity, it will often extract some form of price or be a disruption in our lives.
Absolutely. And this, so with Awakening the Witch Blood, there is this idea that when you become a witch, no matter what folklore that you're looking at, to be a witch, there is some sort of experience. And that experience oftentimes in the folklore is not pleasant. There's some sort of ordeal that you have to go through, or there is some sort of journey that you have to make, or pilgrimage you have to make, or there are elements that you have to create relationships with, or spirits that you have to consistently engage with. So it's by that engagement and that practice, which is why we call it a practice of witchcraft, because you have to consistently do it, that you're building that muscle and building that that capacity. And so that is a long and not easy journey, the long and winding crooked road, as it were. and that's not for everybody. So in some way, there is that idea of sacrifice if you truly want something of value. If you want magic and you want power, well, then the universe has to be able to know that you can be trusted with it. So there are experiences that I think in order to go through these initiations, or in order to come into one's own power as a witch, that can be by trauma, that can be by dedication, that can be by initiation. But there's a journey to that, and there is some element of sacrifice, whether that be of yourself, of your time, and just of different things that go into that, because so much of witchcraft, as much as it is a practice for me, and very much how I write about it, talk about it, and how I teach it, is it's not just a practice, it's also a lifestyle. It's a practice within a lifestyle, um, because a witch is an everyday existence, and it's not a title that I'm just popping on when I'm doing a circle. I am a witch when I breathe, every moment of every day.
As we said, Tip becomes Princess Ozma, the rightful ruler of the land of Oz, and we find out I believe it might not be until the next book, but we find out that there is a long line of rulers of Oz, and when it's a king, he's named Oz, and when it's a queen, she's named Ozma, and it does sound very similar to James Frazier's theory and documentation of sacred kingship, which is a concept you mentioned earlier. Would you like to explain that to people?
Yeah. So there's a couple sort of instances, but like we have Fraser using these sort of references, talking about these sort of earlier cultic rites, where like Oz is coming up as names of magic, where Oz is coming up as a name of kingship and the sacrificial king myth specifically. But Oz is also associated with this sense of like the outer. So sometimes I like to compare it to the outer zone, which there was reference made to this in a sci-fi adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. But it is this idea of like the time and space and energy, or like the dark matter that is causing these things to have form. So if we're using Kabbalic terms for this is going to be Bina. This is the form. This is the dark thing that causes things to bind and stick and coagulate together, which I thought was all very interesting, because this is not things that I think Baum ever would have been aware of. The story that is the most famous for how Oz came about was he had a filing cabinet, and it was, A to C, da da da, and then the last one was O to Z. And so he needed a name for this magical fairyland that he created, and he started, telling his boys, and then he started telling the neighborhood kids, and then he opened up a bazaar and started telling the kids in the shop. So he looked over and he saw, oh, okay, OZ, Oz, perfect, and it just worked. But there are all of these interesting connections with it. But yeah, that's all that's coming to mind. I know I'm blanking.
No, that's fine. I was thinking we could get a little bit more abstract, or zoom out a little bit, because even Baum, in his way, as he continues to work on the series, he's getting further and further enveloped in this co-creation process himself by creating this world that becomes more and more complex as each book comes out.
Yeah.
How applicable do you think is the cosmology of the series, of the books overall, of his mythology overall, to our style of ritual? Despite these discussions and what one might assume from the title of this discussion series, I'm not actually a big fan of the chaos magic approach. I'm not going to knock it for anyone else who is, but it doesn't necessarily work for me, where you fill in names from other sources. But how do you think we could find meaning in our practice through these mythologies?
Absolutely. And I'm in agreement. That's not my practice. That's not what that is for me. But so much of mythology is used as a lens in which we view the world. And going back to my previous point, if we're looking at the characters of these stories as characters, take out the word character, use the word symbol, and look at what that character is representing or what that character is pointing us to. So the symbol is not the thing that is important itself. That is just what is the icon or the mode of representation. What is important about symbols is what they point us to. What do they tell us? What does that mean? And what is going on there? So when we're looking at the character of Tip, Ozma, and that sort of journey, what is the greater, I think, idea or significance of the sacred non-binary, and that being the true ruler, because they've lived and truly have achieved their rulership because they've lived on both sides, because they have this sort of mastery in acceptance of the self on both sides, because they had to figure it out. And they did it with grace, and they did it because they had friendship, and they did it because they have friendship because they needed to create friends. So they created a pumpkin head and a sawhorse and a gump. And then they made friends with those friends with a scarecrow and a tin man and a wattle bug and all, it's just all these nonsensical creatures, because you make friends where your friends are found. Like, so much too, I think, in my personal journey, is I struggled, especially in middle school, high school, with wanting to be in the in crowd, right? And I think people really struggle in terms of finding their place of community. But I think the magic that Ozma teaches us is that, well, you become the monarch of the community that you create. And you make your space for that. And I think there's real magic to that, because from the story of the fairy queen creating Oz to the story of Tip creating these characters, and so on, this is talking about cyclical creation. This idea, as above, so below. We are casting. Every time we're casting, we're taking a microcosm and putting it into the macrocosm. And who's to say that that's not a piece of a macrocosm within a microcosm, an infinite? It gets into the matrix. But this is so much of the paradigm that I think Baum intimately understood and was so fascinated by, because he saw the current of that in the fairy tale tradition. And there was no populated story in America other than, there were the Grimm's tales and there were the Hans Andersen tales, but those were all coming out of Europe. There was nothing by an American writer that was specifically written in strict American prose in layman's language, using the language and the humor of its day. And that's so much part of the charm, but so much too of that magic is that time capsules itself. Just like every time we create magic, it exists in its own plane of existence. It's time capsuled itself. That magic is a reflection of exactly what you were doing, what you knew, and where you were at in that singular point in time. Because when we cast, we stand at a liminal place in between worlds. There is no time or place when we cast magic. So it just exists in the land of other. And that's very much part of Oz's own cosmology and the rules that Oz's own world abides by.
And that is quite a beautiful interpretation. We were discussing, you and I privately, about the character Polychrome and how we both saw her as maybe a mask of Iris, the goddess of the rainbow. And because of our discussion, I'm thinking of Ozma as this goddess queen of sovereignty, almost an Isis character tied to their land. Are there other characters that seem to harken back to other mythological figures to you?
Yeah, Glinda, as the Good Witch of the South, because she holds this sort of immense power over the land of Oz, she is and she's called Glinda the Good, but really, I don't think she's good or bad. I think she's fair. I think she's fair, and I think she's consistent. And she's the most consistent out of all of the witches in Oz, and so that's why she takes power, because she is consistent. Because her rulership comes from her big book of knowledge, where she's every day reading a book that is writing itself of exactly what's going on in real time in the land of Oz. And this is again being written in 1908, way before we had one of these and started reading what's going on in the world in real time. So I think Glinda is tapping into this concept of Mother Fate, of she who is maker because she's informed, because she literally is who holds the book of the law. So Glinda, in this way, with the scroll or the book, is taking the role of the high priestess, and is exuding high priestess energy throughout her entire plot line in the Land of Oz. So that's a big one that comes to mind. I think Jack Pumpkinhead is truly the fool in the tarot, as the fool's journey. The Gnome King, who pops up later and makes pops up throughout, is very much something else. He's he's the Gnome King, and there are gnomes. Those are magical creatures that you can tap into their existence, and there is a Gnome King, and he's very feisty, he's very angry, and he's truly the most dangerous, or he is truly the big baddie villain in the entire canon of the Oz stories. But he's only the big baddie because he's cantankerous, and he's really upset that people keep digging and mining in his mountains and taking his jewels. I mean, the environmental consciousness there for me, I'm kind of like, hey, that's kind of cool. So I think the Gnome King speaks to that idea of elemental court systems, the way that I was trained in traditional craft or old craft. Certainly, this is how it was viewed where my teacher is from. But the idea that these elemental systems all have their own communities or tribes, if you will, and they have different hierarchies. So there's a fairy king, there's a fairy queen, they have children, they have status, there's knights, there's noblemen, like there's a court system. And I think you see that reflected in the gnomes and how they're presented in Oz, but throughout like the Oz system, because there are court systems. Queen of the Mice, Queen of the Field Mice, who pops up a couple of times, but she pops up in Marvelous Land as well to help our friends on their journey.
And that brings up something we haven't touched on that is blatant in these stories, which is how animist they are. And not only animist to the creatures of the forest, but as you mentioned, to sawhorses, to scarecrows.
Yeah, if it has any sort of sentience, it can be manifest. Like there are flowers that can talk, just like in Wonderland. At some points, there are the wattle bug. He's a very thoroughly educated. As that's his whole thing. Is he's very smart. But he's a bug. He's a big bug. But he's the most.
And he's a projection of a big bug, which is like just even cooler.
But I will say, if you watch this musical that we keep referencing, it is the scariest makeup on this poor actor you'll ever see in your life. I don't know how, this is why I think those of us who grew up on 80s films have the sense of humor that we do, and we like ookity dark things, because they scared the friggin' hell out of us growing up. You see, like the big makeup and the
and the witches of Oz, even the stereotypical witches in the fairy tales, I've been considering them a lot. We have this idea of witch ancestors, and that is usually interpreted to mean actual witches who have come before us and who will come after. But I've been contemplating this concept of almost an archetypal witch ancestor as well. and have been pulling on some of these figures, or at least bringing them into mind in that context as they're part of our mythology because we grew up with them. We can't get rid of our associations with them. We became familiarized with them so young. So in a way, they've become like my ancestors as well.
Absolutely. And this is such a core, deep, capital M mystery for me in my personal craft. And because it's my own personal craft, I am at liberty to share it here. So, I really feel strongly that the witch has always followed me throughout my childhood. She was my favorite character in every story. She was who I loved to dress up as every Halloween. There was always not a fascination with the witch. And so much was those stories that I was influenced by and those immediate associations. As you said, I think it's those immediate associations that if it looks witchy, if it smells witchy, it can take you into that current. I think part of the folklore is that witchcraft sometimes is not just a craft. But when you get into like the Inquisitor records, like witchcraft becomes an energy or a force of the devil itself that can just like a wind come up and catch you from behind. So witchcraft is something you could just fall into or get caught up behind without even your knowledge, by getting tricked by a spirit or falling into a bad dealing with somebody. But I do think that there is something to this idea that witchcraft has its own universal grand egregore, and it speaks through the current of the symbols by the very name witch and the associations as a Western culture that we have grown to apply to the witch. But furthermore, my book, specifically chapter 19 in my book, the concept of the first witch, I think really speaks to this idea and to my own mysteries of all witches stretching back from the beginning of time to all of the witches that are been here now that are yet to come. And at some level, there is a realm, there is a place where they congregate and come together. And this is what's called the Sabbath or the Sabbat. And it is a oniric realm. It is the dreaming state. You find it in meditation, you find it in trance, you find it in the woods, you find it when the spontaneous spirit of magic, not necessarily that formal ritual that you get together with the coven to do, but when you and your friends and people who could just speak your language or just yourself get caught up by something and need to do magic because you feel quickened, you feel charged. The spirit of witchcraft brings you in, and it is that archetypal witch, the first witch, and how we see her, who is the guide, who brings us in. Because that's also the first, I think, human. I think the first woman who ever accessed the mysteries, who ever accessed magic, whether that be because Lumiel fell and had loving relationships with her, as the Book of Enoch will talk about, or whether it be that Diana and Apollo, Lucifer, came together and gave the gospel of the witches. Whatever the interpretation may be, there is a spirit and there is an archetype that we as a culture have grown to know, and it is by any matter of the different styles or the different art forms that we have come to know as traditions of witchcraft that are different takes on this being. But if you're able to consistently tap into it enough, you're going to find yourself magically, somehow, some way, meeting her, and she'll take you to that Sabbath that I speak of.
I think that is a wonderfully mysterious note for us to end on today. I've really enjoyed our discussion, Nathan. You are so fun and easy to talk to, yet so incredibly knowledgeable. I've read Awakening the Witchblood, and I will say a lot of books that are coming out right now, of course, have limitations from their publisher, but word limits and depth of practice seem to be getting lighter and lighter. And this was the complete opposite of that. This was a highly in-depth and nearly academic take on the history of witchcraft and our mythology and the practice. So it was a wonderful, beautiful, surprising read. I recommend it to everyone. Is there anything else that you were hoping we would discuss today that we did not get to yet?
Oh no, we covered all the bases. I just hope people get as excited for Oz as much as I do, because there's so many different worlds of Oz, and just like, if you go to a horror fandom convention, there's all these different sort of fandoms in the world of horror. Well, that's kind of the same in the world of Oz, because you've got the book people, you got the movie people, you got the theater people who are in it for the musical and the elements, you got the whiz people, you got the Return to Oz people. So there are all these different worlds of Oz, and the books really, I think, speak to our own mystical occult current, because Baum himself was a part of that mystical occult current.
And for those of us here in the USA, again, it's like a modern USA mythology that is ripe for us to tap into.
Absolutely, because we recognize exactly what he's doing as an American. He's pulling from his own land and the people he is interacting with, because that's just what we do. We can't help it. That's human nature. And by nature of being American, we have this diversity where it informs us in a way that our mythologies become these very independent things, but also they do take inspiration from all of these other things.
So, Awakening the Witchblood is the title of your first book, and that is available through Crosscrow Books and everywhere else that you might get your mystical publications.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere else you would like people to find you?
So you can definitely find me on Crosscrow Books. I'm also nathanking.witch on TikTok. You can find me on YouTube as well. I have a Facebook page where you can like me as Nathan King Witch and author. So all of those things are active, and I've got a lot of exciting events coming up, very exciting projects planned in the future. So just keep your eyes on that social media, because hopefully there will be some very exciting announcements in the next couple weeks.
Thank you. And until we meet again, may all your travels be filled with wonder.